A millionaire is left in shock when she discovers that her husband and children are conspiring together to take her entire fortune. But then, she does this. From a very young age, Michelle learned that nothing in life would be given to her for free. The only child of a humble couple, she lost her parents early and was forced to mature before her time. The world showed no mercy. Without support, she worked from a young age, grabbing onto any opportunity to survive. Each obstacle made her stronger, more strategic. There was no room for weakness. Only hard work and intelligence could secure her future. It was in this way that she built her fashion empire. She started with a small clothing store, carefully selecting each piece until she became a respected businesswoman. Her growth was relentless, the result of sleepless nights and constant sacrifices. Success brought luxury, but there was no room for breaks. Her life was measured by signed contracts and successful negotiations, leaving little time for anything else. Love was never a priority, but Jonathan appeared in her path. Initially the manager of one of her stores, he proved to be reliable and dedicated. Without any romantic promises or fiery passions, he became her steady partner, someone who balanced her exhausting routine. They married, and over time, children came. Pamela was born first, then Andrew. Michelle wanted to be a present mother, but her career always spoke louder. She missed birthdays, school meetings, and moments that would never come back. She tried to make up for her absence with expensive gifts, but soon realized that wasn't enough. Jonathan was always there, a caring father, a safe harbor for the children. The distance grew gradually. Pamela, with her strong personality, became reserved. Andrew, more calm, followed his sister, seeking refuge in his father. Michelle increasingly found herself a stranger in her own home. But despite the coldness, her children still spoke to her, still tried to show some love, even if in a restrained way. She never allowed herself to mourn. She believed that all of it was part of the choices she had to make. But sometimes, in the silence of her luxurious home, an uncomfortable doubt haunted her. Had she gained everything at the cost of what really mattered? As the years went by, her children became even more distant, colder, and much closer to their father, who was always there for them, ready to give what Michelle couldn't: time. Michelle always had absolute control over her routine. Every decision, every commitment, every document signed went through her hands with precision. But lately, something seemed off. Small details that once never escaped her attention began to slip away in the chaos of everyday life. At first, she didn't think much of it. After all, it was normal to forget one or two things when managing an empire. But the incidents began to repeat themselves. One morning, while reviewing an important contract in her office, she furrowed her brow. She knew she had already signed that document. She was sure of it. But there it was, intact, without her signature. "I must have confused it," she muttered to herself, trying to push away the discomfort. Another day, she forgot a crucial meeting with a supplier and only realized when she received a call from her assistant. "Ma'am, the company representative has been waiting in the meeting room for half an hour," the woman said on the other end of the line. Michelle rubbed her forehead, feeling a slight tremor in her fingers. "Meeting room? But isn't that meeting tomorrow?" There was an uncomfortable silence. "No, ma'am. It's been scheduled for today for weeks. You confirmed it yesterday morning." She hung up without responding and took a deep breath, trying to ignore the growing discomfort inside her. The episodes started to become more frequent. Items she left in one place were found elsewhere. Her phone, which always sat on her bedside table, was found inside the refrigerator. Documents disappeared and were later found in drawers she swore she never placed them in. Moreover, she felt tired all the time, as if a thick fog covered her mind. Small dizziness and memory lapses turned her routines into exhausting challenges. One night, when she arrived home, she found Jonathan sitting in the living room, watching her with a look she couldn't decipher. "Michelle, can I talk to you?" he asked, closing the newspaper he had been holding. She sighed and dropped her purse on the couch. "If it's quick, I've had a grueling day." Jonathan slowly got up and watched her for a moment before speaking. "Strange things have been happening. You've been acting differently." She frowned. "Differently? What do you mean?" "Small forgetfulness," he said, measuring his words. "The other day, Pamela said she found you standing in the kitchen, staring at nothing. She called you several times and you didn't respond." Michelle crossed her arms. "This is ridiculous. I was just tired, that's all." "I understand," Jonathan insisted with a careful tone, "but Andrew also noticed something. He said you asked him the same question twice in the same conversation." "That happens to anyone," she retorted, her voice becoming sharper. "We all get distracted sometimes." Jonathan sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "I just want to make sure everything's okay. Maybe we should schedule a doctor's appointment just to be sure." Michelle felt the blood rush to her face. "Are you calling me sick?" "That's not it, love," he said softly. "It's just precaution." She turned her back, refusing to continue the conversation. But his words kept ringing in her mind. In the following days, Pamela and Andrew began to reinforce the same concerns. Every small mistake she made was pointed out with calculated gentleness. "Mom, you forgot again where you put your keys," Pamela casually remarked one afternoon. "This isn't normal, Mom," Andrew added. Michelle started to doubt herself. She knew she was tired, she knew work was consuming her energy, but was there really something wrong with her? Jonathan and her children kept pointing out her lapses as something concerning. It was a look of constant worry, a voice always careful but insistent. That night, after dinner, Jonathan pulled up a chair at the table and watched her for a long moment before speaking. "Michelle, we need to talk." She looked up from her phone, where she was reading an important email, and frowned. "About what?" Jonathan looked at the children, who were sitting nearby, as if preparing them to support his words. "About your health." Michelle rolled her eyes and threw the phone on the table. "Not this again. Love, we care about you," he insisted. "I scheduled an appointment for you with a specialist." The air between them grew heavy. "You what?" she asked, her voice full of disbelief. "I scheduled an appointment," he repeated calmly. "He's a highly respected doctor, a neurologist, just to check, to make sure everything's fine." Michelle crossed her arms. "This is a complete exaggeration. You're making drama over nothing." "Mom," Pamela intervened, her tone gentle but firm, "we just want to make sure you're okay." "I'm fine," Michelle snapped, her patience running thin. "You're acting like I'm losing my mind." "It's not that," Andrew joined the conversation. "But you've been forgetting important things. I know you're overwhelmed, but what if it's something more serious?" Michelle stood up from the table, pushing the chair back roughly. "This is ridiculous. I'm not going to any doctor." Jonathan sighed and stood up too. "Then tell me, Michelle, what does it cost? Just one appointment, one checkup. If it's nothing, great. But what if it's something we can treat from the start?" "There's nothing to treat," she snapped, irritated. Jonathan looked at her with that calm, calculated gaze. "You've always faced everything head-on. You've always taken control of your life. But now you're running away, running from the possibility that something might be wrong." She hesitated. "I've scheduled it for tomorrow morning," Jonathan continued, his voice still calm but firm. "If you don't want to go, fine, but I really hope you do, for us." Michelle looked at her children. Pamela was holding her hands together, her eyes down. Andrew was staring at her, waiting for an answer. A storm was brewing inside her. Part of her wanted to get up and shout that they were overreacting. Another much smaller part, whispered that maybe it would be better to be sure. She sighed. Fine, tomorrow, but only to put an end to this conversation. The next morning, Michelle walked into the doctor's office with firm steps, but her chest was tight. Jonathan sat next to her in the waiting room, while Pamela and Andrew stood silently. Ms. Michelle? A nurse in a light blue uniform called. She stood up, her stomach churning, and followed her down the brightly lit hallway. The doctor was a middle-aged man with a professional expression. He greeted her with a firm handshake. Please, have a seat, he said, indicating a comfortable chair in front of his desk. Michelle sat down, keeping her back straight. So tell me a little about what you've been feeling, he asked, his tone neutral. She hesitated. Look, I'm only here because my family insists I've been acting differently. But honestly, I think it's just stress. I understand, said the doctor. But tell me about the symptoms they've noticed. She rolled her eyes. Small forgetfulness, nothing major. I mix things up, forget appointments. But who doesn't do that? The doctor jotted something down on his notepad. And what about your energy? Have you been feeling more tired than usual? She bit her lip. Yes, but that's expected. I work a lot. Have you felt dizzy? Unusual sleepiness? She hesitated before answering. Sometimes. The doctor continued asking detailed questions about her routine, her diet, her sleep. He then performed some tests. He studied her answers for a long moment. Then he took a deep breath. Ms. Michelle, based on your symptoms and the tests conducted, there are strong indications that we're dealing with a progressive neurological disorder that affects your memory and cognition. The air left her lungs like a punch. Is this serious? She asked, her voice coming out weaker than she intended. We need to conduct further tests to confirm, but the signs are present. Michelle blinked rapidly, feeling the world spin around her. This explains a lot, Jonathan said, breaking the silence. She turned to him, shocked. Explains. The forgetfulness, the behavioral changes, Andrew said, his voice quiet. Pamela simply nodded, avoiding her gaze. The doctor continued. If confirmed, there are treatments that can slow the progression of the condition, but it's something that needs to be closely monitored. Michelle wanted to say something, wanted to deny it, wanted to scream that this was nonsense. But all she could do was close her eyes for a moment, feeling a crushing weight on her shoulders. In the days that followed, rumors about her supposed condition began to circulate within the company. Hallways were filled with muffled whispers. Pitiful glances followed her wherever she went. Michelle felt suffocated, as if an invisible cloak of distrust covered everything around her. Then came the final blow. That night, Michelle was sitting on the living room couch. She felt exhausted, the weight of the diagnosis still pressing on her chest. Her mind was foggy, as if she were always trying to grasp something that slipped through her fingers. Jonathan entered the room calmly, holding an envelope in his hands. He approached and sat down beside her. Love, there's something here you need to sign, he said, his tone calm. Michelle blinked a few times, bringing her attention back to him. What is it? He smiled in a knowing way and placed the envelope in her hands. The documents you asked the lawyer for. She frowned, confused. What documents? The ones transferring your assets to me and the kids, he said, as if it were obvious. You asked for this 2 days ago. Michelle felt a knot tighten in her stomach. I asked? She asked, feeling a slight tremor in her fingers as she opened the envelope and pulled out the papers. Yes, Jonathan confirmed patiently. You called the lawyer and asked him to arrange everything. He just sent me to bring it to you. Michelle flipped through the papers. The transfer was clear, but something caught her eye. There was no signature. But I haven't signed anything yet, she said, looking up at him. Of course not, he replied casually. The document just arrived, you need to sign it now. She pressed her lips together. I don't remember asking for this, Jonathan. He tilted his head slightly, as if not wanting to pressure her. I understand, love, but you can call the lawyer and confirm. He'll tell you it was you who made the request. Michelle hesitated. Part of her felt something was wrong, but there was no reason to distrust Jonathan. Not him, not the father of her children. She picked up the phone and dialed the lawyer's number. Jonathan watched in silence as she waited for the call to be answered. Good evening, Ms. Michelle, said the lawyer on the other end of the line. She wet her lips. Good evening. I have a document here about the transfer of my assets. Jonathan told me I asked for this. Yes, ma'am, the lawyer confirmed without hesitation. I received your call 2 days ago. You instructed me to arrange the paperwork and send it as quickly as possible. Michelle stood in silence, her heart pounding in her chest. I called you, she asked, almost in a whisper. Yes, he reaffirmed. We spoke for a few minutes and you explained exactly what you wanted. Michelle felt her throat dry. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. I understand. Thank you, she said before hanging up. She held the phone for a few moments, trying to make sense of it all. How could she not remember something so important? Jonathan watched her calmly, as if he already knew the answer she had received. Now, do you believe me? He asked, without any accusation in his tone. Michelle rubbed her temples. I don't know. I really don't remember doing that. Jonathan smiled faintly. That's part of what the doctor explained, love. Small forgetfulness, confusion. It's normal. She pressed her hands to the sides of her head, feeling a slight dizziness. But how could I forget something like this? How could I not remember asking for this? Jonathan placed a comforting hand on hers. If it makes you uncomfortable, you don't have to sign it now. As she looked up at him, surprised. If I don't remember asking for this, she said, her voice now firmer, I can't sign it. He gave a soft sigh and gathered the papers. Okay, it's your decision. Michelle expected a different reaction. She expected him to insist, to try to convince her, but he didn't do any of that. He simply collected the documents and stood up. If you need more time to think, I understand, he said before leaving the room. She sat there alone, staring at the empty space. Something inside her screamed that this didn't make sense, but her mind, foggy and exhausted, told her it was probably just the disease. Michelle spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room, staring at the empty space. The document still haunted her thoughts, but she tried to push the thoughts away. She needed to trust Jonathan. She needed to trust her family. But what if she really had asked for that document and simply forgotten? The doctor had said this could happen. She took a deep breath, trying to convince herself that everything was fine, but that uncomfortable feeling continued to grow inside her. The next night, Michelle decided she needed to step out of her office for a while. The diagnosis still left her restless, and the constant sense of exhaustion and confusion only grew her frustration. Maybe a quiet dinner with her family would help clear her mind. Entering the kitchen to get a glass of water, she found Jonathan standing by the stove, focused on dinner. This wasn't unusual. He always cooked. It was his habit, something he made a point of doing even with employees around. She approached slowly, watching him in silence. He stirred the sauce gently with a wooden spoon. It was then that she noticed something. Jonathan picked up one of the plates from the counter and pulled it a little closer. Michelle recognized the plate immediately. It was always hers. There was no doubt about it. Jonathan was meticulous with the table setting. His portion was always separated first, and only after that did he distribute the rest. A small detail she always found curious but never questioned. He kept cooking, his movements precise, natural, but then something different happened. With his free hand, he discreetly reached into his pants pocket. It was such a small gesture, so quick that Michelle almost didn't notice, but she was used to noticing even the smallest details. She saw when he pulled out a small, transparent bottle, about the size of a spice jar. There was no label. He held it for a moment, checking how much was left inside, and then, with almost imperceptible movement, he twisted the cap, tilted the bottle, and sprinkled a fine powder onto her plate. Her breath left her lungs. Her heart raced inside her chest, the pulse echoing in her ears. Her hands began to sweat, and a strange chill ran down her spine. For a moment, she thought she was imagining things, that her mind was playing tricks on her. But she wasn't. She saw it clearly when Jonathan stirred the powder into the dish, disguising the movement, as if he wanted to ensure everything stayed unnoticed. And then, he kept stirring the sauce as if nothing had happened. Michelle remained still. She didn't know what that powder was. It could be a new spice, some herb he was trying. But then, why only on her plate? The answer was there. And for the first time, Michelle knew with absolute certainty that Jonathan was not the man she thought she knew. She had to pretend she hadn't seen anything. She took a deep breath, controlled her expression, and stepped forward, forcing her voice to sound natural. "The smell is great." Jonathan turned around, surprised, but quickly smiled. "I wanted you to have dinner with us tonight. You've been working so much." She kept smiling, even though she felt the bitter taste of fear in her throat. "Of course, I think a family dinner will do me good." He smiled contentedly and returned to stirring the pot as if nothing had happened. Michelle stood there for a few moments, absorbing everything. She saw it, saw him sprinkle the powder only on her plate. But was she overreacting? Could it just be a spice, some special ingredient? But then, why not put it on everyone else's food? The thought tormented her as dinner was served. Jonathan placed the dishes on the table, just like he always did. Michelle watched every move he made with heightened attention. No hesitation, no suspicious expression. She sat down, but she couldn't take her eyes off her own plate. The smell was the same as always. The appearance of the food, identical. What if she was imagining things? What if it was just her mind playing tricks on her, as the doctors had said it could? She tried to push the thought away. She picked up her utensils and pretended everything was normal. She brought a bite to her lips and then placed the fork back on the plate, simply moving the food around. Jonathan glanced at her for a moment, but then went back to chatting with the kids about trivialities. Dinner went on, and when Jonathan got up to get more water, Michelle saw her chance. With a discreet move, she quickly swapped her plate with Jonathan's. She just moved the glasses a little to the side to disguise the movement. He returned, sat down, and resumed his meal. Her heart beat fast, waiting for any reaction. A twitch, a change in his expression. But nothing happened. Jonathan ate normally. Does that mean it wasn't poison? Or did he know exactly what he was mixing? Something that wouldn't affect him immediately? She didn't have answers. Just a growing fear gnawing at her certainty. If she was right, if Jonathan was really putting something in her food, then her entire reality was crumbling before her eyes. But if she was wrong, then it meant her mind was no longer reliable. The anguish made her press her hands to her face, her fingers pressing against her temples. Uncertainty was a poison worse than anything Jonathan could be giving her. And what if it was just paranoia? After all, the doctor had said that memory lapses and confusion were common symptoms. It could have just been a coincidence, a misinterpretation caused by her own fear. But the fact that Jonathan had only sprinkled the powder on her plate and not anyone else's kept hammering in her mind. She couldn't trust her own memory, but she could still trust what she saw with her own eyes. If there was something wrong, she needed proof. And there was only one person she could turn to. Eric. Eric had been her personal lawyer for many years, a man with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. He had advised her from the first years of her rise in business and had been by her side during crucial moments of her career. But about a year ago, he decided to retire. He said he no longer had the energy to deal with the legal complexities her company required. Although still active in law, he preferred to step away from business matters and recommended another lawyer to take his place. Michelle trusted him like few others. If there was anyone who wouldn't look down on her or treat her like a fragile woman, it was Eric. She drove straight to his old office. It was a discreet building away from the major business centers. Small but refined. Exactly the kind of place Eric would choose for his active retirement. When she entered, the secretary immediately recognized her and signaled that she could go to the office without announcing herself. Eric was sitting behind a mahogany desk, glasses perched on the tip of his nose, reviewing some documents. When he looked up and saw her, he smiled. Michelle. His voice was the same as always, firm, confident. What a surprise. What brings you here? She closed the door behind her and sat down without ceremony. Eric, I need your help. His smile disappeared. He studied her face for a moment and dropped the papers onto the desk. You look pale, he observed. What happened? Michelle hesitated. She didn't know how to say it out loud. I think I'm being poisoned, she finally said. The silence that followed was long and heavy. Eric didn't blink. He didn't laugh. He didn't show exaggerated surprise. He just stared at her for a few seconds, then leaned forward, crossing his fingers on the desk. Explain. She took a deep breath. Jonathan, last night, I saw him putting something in my food. Are you sure? I saw it with my own eyes. He put it on your plate or everyone's food. Only mine, she replied, feeling her throat tighten. Eric rested his chin on his hand, deep in thought. Did you feel any strange effects afterward? I didn't eat, she said quickly. Good. Michelle ran her fingers through her hair nervously. I don't know what to think, Eric. I have this diagnosis. But what if I'm imagining it all? He narrowed his eyes. If you were imagining things, he would have put it in everyone's food, not just yours. Michelle, this is serious, he said, but without concrete proof, any accusation can be turned back on you. She nodded, feeling the adrenaline surge through her body. What do I do? The next days were a silent hell. With Eric's guidance, Michelle began to act with caution. First, she needed to recover the bottle Jonathan was using, then get concrete records. That night, after everyone went to bed, Michelle sat on the bed for a few minutes, breathing deeply. She knew she couldn't waste time. She needed to find that bottle. But where would Jonathan hide it? He wouldn't be careless enough to leave it in the kitchen. If he was trying to cover something up, where would he place it? Michelle knew Jonathan had a place where he kept important documents and items. A small locked cabinet in his office. He always kept the key in his pocket, but sometimes, when coming home from work, he would leave it on the wooden tray on the bedroom dresser. She quietly got up and crept down the hallway. The bedroom was dark, and Jonathan was sleeping soundly. There was the tray, and there, among some coins and a wristwatch, was the key. Her heart raced. She carefully took it and went to the office. With trembling hands, she turned the key in the lock. The cabinet creaked slightly as it opened. Inside, there were files, papers organized, and in the far corner a small transparent bottle. She picked it up, feeling her fingers shake. The contents were a very fine white powder. Her stomach churned. It was going into her food. She quickly took several photos of the bottle with her phone. Then, she took some of the powder with a napkin, folding it carefully before placing it inside a small plastic bag. She returned to the bedroom cautiously, put the key back in the exact place where she had found it, and lay down, her heart still pounding. Now, she had something concrete. And the next day, that powder would have one destination, Eric's trusted lab. But it wasn't enough yet. So, Michelle moved on to the next phase of the plan, surveillance. Every movement needed to be precise, discreet. She couldn't raise suspicion. If they noticed any change in her behavior, everything would be lost. She installed small cameras, hidden in strategic corners of the rooms. The kitchen, Jonathan's office, the living room. Microphones were carefully placed, ensuring every conversation would be captured. In the first days, she didn't get anything but trivialities. The routine continued the same, with no mention of what was going on. Jonathan kept his usual routine, but Michelle knew she had to be patient. He had been acting in the shadows for a long time, and sooner or later they would lower their guard. Then, it happened. It was late afternoon when Jonathan entered the office. Michelle, watching from the computer screen in her bedroom, saw him sit in the leather chair and pick up the phone. Her body tensed immediately. "She's completely convinced," he said, his voice low but clear enough for the microphone to capture every word. "The symptoms are getting worse, just as expected." Michelle felt a cold chill run down her spine. "The powder is working," Jonathan continued. "She's tired, confused, and more importantly, she's starting to doubt herself." The voice from the other end of the line was recognized by Michelle. It was the doctor's voice. "Great," he said, with a tone of professional satisfaction. "If it keeps going like this, in a few weeks she'll be completely dependent on you. We can already start the legal process." Her heart almost stopped. "We're already taking care of that," Jonathan replied. "The lawyer already falsified the necessary documents. We just need to convince her to sign without hesitation." Michelle's body shook. Pamela and Andrew, her children, they were in on it too. The shock was so intense that for a moment she stopped breathing. The voices kept going in the room, but everything around her seemed to disappear. They were involved. They were helping Jonathan destroy her. Her own children. The recording kept playing. "When she signs the transfer," Jonathan said, "there won't be anything she can do." "Are you sure the lawyer did everything right?" Pamela asked. "Of course," Jonathan smiled. "He knows that if anything goes wrong, we're all committed." The lawyer's voice appeared, distant but audible in the call. "Don't worry," he said. "The papers are ready and the dates are set. As soon as she signs, the assets will officially be transferred to you. No court can contest it." Michelle closed her eyes, feeling the tears burn her skin. There was the proof. Everything was recorded, every word, every confession. There were no more doubts. They wanted to steal from her. They wanted to ruin her. And for a moment she felt a devastating anger take over her. But she wouldn't cry. Not now. She just breathed deeply, leaned back in her chair, and pressed a single button on the computer. The button that would save every one of these recordings as concrete proof. Now she had everything she needed. She grabbed a thumb drive, transferred the recordings and videos, storing everything with extreme care. Then she breathed deeply, grabbed her purse, and left the house. She had a specific destination: Eric. When she entered the lawyer's office, she felt a mix of relief and tension. Eric looked up from some papers and frowned when he saw her. "Do you have something for me?" he asked, but from the look on her face he already knew the answer. Michelle sat down and placed the thumb drive on the table. "Here's everything. What Jonathan did, what the lawyer and the doctor planned, even my kids." Her voice faltered slightly, but she steadied herself. "They were involved. I heard it all." Eric picked up the thumb drive and sighed heavily. "I wish I was surprised, Michelle, but I'm not. What matters now is that we have concrete proof." She nodded, crossing her arms. "What do we do now?" He adjusted himself in his chair. "We'll file the lawsuit immediately. But until that happens, you need to disappear for a while." Michelle furrowed her brow. "Disappear?" "Yes. Jonathan, the lawyer, and the doctor are already ready to push you into a mental collapse, And now that the situation is reaching its peak, anything you say or do can be used against you. If they notice you're more alert, they might try to silence you for good." She pressed her fingers against the table. "What do you suggest?" "We'll pretend you're going on a business trip," he said calmly. "Say you need to get away for a few weeks to rest and take care of business matters. But in reality, you'll disappear. No phone, no computer, no communication." Michelle hesitated. "What if they suspect?" "Jonathan can contest it, but he can't stop it. If you insist enough, he'll cave in. And when they least expect it, everything will come crashing down." She was silent for a moment. Then she sighed deeply. "Okay, I'll do it." Eric leaned back in his chair. "Before you go, there's one thing I need to show you." He opened a drawer and took out an envelope, the result of the substance that was in the bottle. Michelle grabbed the paper and began reading. Her heart raced when she got to the main part. It was a low-dose sedative that, in small daily amounts, caused drowsiness, dizziness, and cognitive difficulties. But what made her shiver was the next detail. With prolonged use, the effects could simulate the early symptoms of a degenerative neurological disorder. In other words, he was manufacturing the disease that would make her lose everything. She closed her eyes for a moment, holding the paper tightly. "I already suspected," she said softly. "I heard something about it in the recording." Eric watched her closely. "Are you ready for this?" Michelle looked up at him, her eyes filled with cold determination. "Yes, and I'm going to take them all down." That night when she got home, she announced the trip. "I need to take care of some business out of town," she said at the dinner table, her voice firm and unwavering. Jonathan frowned. "Now? With everything going on with you?" "Exactly because of that," she replied. "I want to get things organized before my health gets any worse." Pamela and Andrew exchanged glances. "Are you sure this is a good idea, Mom?" Pamela asked. "Maybe it would be better if you rested here." Michelle forced a smile. "I'll rest, just not here." Jonathan sighed, clearly uncomfortable. "Well, if that's what you want, I won't stop you." She nodded. They didn't know that, in reality, they were about to be destroyed. The next morning, Michelle left the house without saying where she was going. She rented a car and drove to a small hotel in an unfamiliar city. No phone, no computer, no communication with the outside world. Days passed slowly, and to her surprise, her body began to improve. The extreme tiredness diminished, the dizziness stopped. The fog in her mind lifted, and she realized with horror how much she had been manipulated. Without that daily poison, she was becoming herself again. Then, weeks later, the hotel phone rang. She answered with trembling hands. "Michelle," Eric said, "the trial is tomorrow." She took a deep breath. "I'm ready." When Michelle entered the courtroom the next morning, the buzz was immediate. All eyes turned to her, as if she were a survivor returning from a war. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered to each other. The case had already gained notoriety. Jonathan, the doctor, the lawyer, Pamela, and Andrew were sitting in the defendant's box. All of them. Her own children were next to the men who had tried to destroy her. She stopped for a moment, staring at them. They stared back, but none of them dared to say anything. Pamela looked away, hands clasped in her lap. Andrew bit his lip, uneasy. Jonathan kept his posture proud, as if he still believed he would walk out victorious. The doctor and the lawyer simply waited, confident in their defenses. Michelle walked to her seat next to Eric. "Are you ready to see them fall?" he asked in a low tone. She didn't answer. She wanted to see how far they would go to try to defend themselves. The judge entered, and the trial began. The prosecution presented the evidence. The videos came first. Images of Jonathan sprinkling the substance on her plate, stirring it calmly, without hesitation. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The audios came next. The clear voices conspiring. Does she already believe she's sick? Yes, but we need to reinforce that before we take the next step. The falsified documents are ready. As soon as she signs, we'll end this once and for all. She's already completely lost. We've moved things around, hidden papers. She's falling right into it. Michelle looked at Pamela and Andrew when this last sentence was played. The children lowered their heads, but it was too late. The prosecution was relentless. "Mr. Jonathan," said the prosecutor, turning to him, "do you have anything to say about these recordings?" "This was taken out of context," Jonathan replied, his tone cold and calculated. "My wife was already debilitated, and we had to take measures to protect her." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "Protect? By poisoning her?" "There's no proof that the substance caused direct harm," Jonathan countered, holding his head high. The prosecutor smiled slyly. "Funny you should say that. The toxicology report proves the substance administered caused symptoms of confusion and prolonged tiredness, and if it continued, it could lead to irreversible damage." The silence fell in the courtroom. Michelle watched Jonathan. For the first time, the man who had always maintained control looked lost. The prosecutor turned to Pamela and Andrew. "Miss Pamela, Mr. Andrew," he said, crossing his arms, "you actively participated in this manipulation. There are recordings proving you hid documents, moved objects, and helped your mother doubt her own sanity. What do you have to say?" Pamela finally looked up, but her expression was harsh. "We didn't do anything wrong. We just wanted what was rightfully ours." The courtroom murmured. Michelle felt a tightness in her chest. She showed no remorse. The prosecutor turned to Andrew. "And you?" Andrew looked at his sister, then at the floor. His face was pale. "I just did what I was told," he murmured. The prosecutor turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the prosecution has presented irrefutable evidence that all the defendants actively participated in a conspiracy to incapacitate Michelle and seize her assets. We request the conviction of all those involved for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted poisoning." And the defense attorney tried to intervene, tried to discredit the evidence, tried to paint Michelle as an unstable woman, but it was all for nothing. The judge turned to the defendants. "In light of the evidence presented and the recorded testimonies, I declare Jonathan, the doctor and the lawyer, guilty of conspiracy, fraud, and attempted poisoning. I also declare Pamela and Andrew guilty of actively participating in the psychological manipulation and attempted fraud against their own mother. All defendants are sentenced to prison in a closed regime. The impact of the sentence hit the courtroom like thunder. Michelle looked at her children. Pamela seemed furious. Andrew was still, wide-eyed. Jonathan shouted, "This is absurd!" The judge slammed the gavel. "The decision is final. The defendants will be taken into custody immediately." The officers approached, handcuffing them one by one. Michelle felt a tightness in her chest as she watched Pamela being taken away. Even after everything, a part of her still wanted to believe her daughter would regret it. But the hateful look Pamela gave her before being dragged away destroyed any hope. "This isn't over," Pamela shouted. "You owe us everything, you ungrateful one." Michelle didn't respond. There was nothing more to say. The guards began to take them away, but then she stood up. "Wait!" Everyone looked at her, confused. She took a deep breath and said to the judge, "I want to withdraw the charges against Pamela and Andrew." The silence in the courtroom was cutting. The judge frowned. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "Jonathan, the lawyer, and the doctor were the real masterminds of this plan. My children were accomplices, yes, but I don't believe prison will fix them. I want them to be free to face the weight of what they've done, without money, without my name to protect them." Pamela and Andrew stared at her, stunned. The judge thought for a moment before speaking. "In light of the victim's request, Pamela and Andrew will be freed. but without access to any financial resources inherited from their mother. The decision will be recorded. The guards released their handcuffs, and Michelle looked at them one last time. "You will never have anything of mine again," she said, her voice firm and cutting. "No money, no inheritance, no forgiveness. Learn to live without me." Pamela looked like she wanted to shout something, but no sound came out. Andrew just lowered his head, destroyed. She left them there. She walked out of the courtroom without looking back. The cold wind of the street blew against her face. For the first time in a long time, she took a deep breath and felt light. She had lost a family, but she would never lose herself again. She had built her life on her own before, and she would do it again. This time, without anyone to bring her down. Because her greatest wealth was never in the money, but in the strength that kept her standing, and that strength no one could ever steal. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.